Picture this. An HOA leader actually broke through my cabin entrance with her foot just as I was enjoying a drink alongside the state's top law enforcement official. In front of the single individual in the nation with authority to imprison her, she performed 6 criminal acts. We're describing complete door destruction, expensive footwear stepping over shattered fragments, everything you can imagine. Wearing her costly blazer and reeking of that overpowering fragrance that likely exceeded my monthly vehicle payment, this individual barged into my family's lakeside retreat, yelling about infractions and authority as though she possessed the deed. She had absolutely no awareness of whom she'd just interrupted. She was completely oblivious that her online broadcast to 3,000 viewers was essentially documenting evidence for her own criminal charges. Half a year prior, I believe Karen represented just another control-obsessed homeowner. Little did I know she was orchestrating a multi-million-dollar theft operation, and I was on the verge of unintentionally exposing her entire illegal network. How would you respond if an unhinged HOA official violated your personal space during your life's most critical appointment? Leave your thoughts in the comments and share your location. I'm certain many of you have encountered these community tyrants previously. Allow me to rewind and explain how this catastrophe began. 6 months back, existence was quite pleasant. I go by Marcus Henley. My age is 52. Following 3 decades of laboring through muddy excavations, setting up electrical systems throughout 3 regions, I'd rightfully earned my time to rest. The treasure of my achievements, my grandfather's waterfront retreat at Clearwater Lake, a 2-acre paradise that old Pop purchased in 1963 for $800. $800 for waterfront land now valued higher than most residential properties. Can you fathom that? This structure wasn't some pretentious modern mansion. I'm describing timber logs assembled manually, a rock fireplace that Pop constructed with his work-worn hands, and an enclosed veranda that made familiar sounds in the most comforting ways. I'd maintained it entirely independent from utilities intentionally, solar energy systems operating silently overhead, while water tasting like memories from youth, and a waste management system functioning more efficiently than typical municipal infrastructure. The dawn vapor ascending from the water each sunrise showed me Pop's reasoning for selecting this location. His words were, "The property selects you, never the reverse." He possessed wisdom. He also warned me, "Marcus, whenever somebody desires your property intensely, investigate their motivation since it typically holds greater worth than their claims suggest." Then her arrival changed everything. Delilah Cromwell, whom everybody simply identified as that unhinged HOA official, arrived at our tranquil lakeside neighborhood like a destructive storm wearing luxury apparel. 58 years of age, recently relocated from some California development where apparently neighborhood dictatorship served as her primary occupation. Her vehicle was an ivory Escalade displaying personalized plates reading, "Rule 1. I'm being completely truthful." She displayed her HOA leadership badge on her jacket as though it represented law enforcement authority. This individual had one singular objective: converting our traditional waterfront into what she termed a premium vacation destination. Here's the information I lacked at that moment. 3 senior households had already transferred their properties to interested purchasers within 8 weeks of her emergence. Peculiar timing, wouldn't you say? Her initial aggressive action occurred on a Tuesday dawn. I was relaxing on Pop's veranda enjoying coffee and observing a loon couple instructing their offspring to plunge when I detected these sharp tapping noises across my timber pier. Luxury heels. At 7 in the morning on my personal land. 10 minutes following, she was attaching this authoritative-appearing document to my screen entrance. The citation stated, "Unattractive dock construction diminishing neighborhood asset values. Penalty, $500. Adherence mandatory within 72 hours or accumulating daily charges will apply." That I needed to review it twice. My aged dock, the identical structure Pop and I had strengthened collectively during my 12th year, was seemingly an offensive sight endangering the complete community's property market. As a logical individual, I approached to clarify that my land actually existed before the HOA by roughly 4 decades. Her response to me standing in my own entrance area, hands positioned on her waist as though she controlled everything. "Every lakefront resident reports to me, darling. Question the Hendersons regarding their experience challenging me." The Hendersons, My senior neighbors who'd mysteriously chosen to reduce their living space last month following 23 years of residence there. The connections weren't forming yet, but something unsettling developed in my core. She then commenced her photography session, circling my structure like a property evaluator, capturing images of my solar equipment, my produce garden, even my grandfather's hand-carved veranda railings. The scent of her synthetic air treatment emanating from that running Escalade triggered my nausea. Before the week concluded, I possessed 3 additional citations. Each arrived with increasing penalties. Each made abundantly evident that Delilah Cromwell had initiated warfare against everything my family had constructed on this property. I assumed I was managing your standard power-abusing neighbor. Irritating, certainly, but controllable. My ignorance regarding having painted a target upon myself in a game significantly larger and more hazardous than trivial HOA conflicts would soon end. Pop's guidance resonated in my thoughts. Discover their motivation for wanting your property. I was approaching that discovery, and it would transform everything. Karen didn't delay in advancing to serious measures. 3 days following my adherence deadline's passage, because genuinely, I refused to dismantle Pop's dock for some aspiring dictator. A certified document arrived that made my coffee taste terrible. The letter demanded cessation and outlined infractions of neighborhood waterway regulations. The letterhead displayed Blackstone, Meyer, and Associates. One of those expensive legal practices where the senior lawyers likely bill hourly rates exceeding my monthly earnings. The legal terminology essentially stated my dock was unlawfully extending in a shared waterway, and I was liable for $3,000 in retrospective infraction charges. Additionally, they threatened to impose a lien against my property without payment within 10 days. My immediate reaction was alarm. These individuals had legal representation. I possessed a toolbox and an unpleasant disposition. Then I recalled something Pop consistently emphasized during those extended fishing excursions. Marcus, whenever someone's attempting to legally manipulate you from your property, genuine truth always exists in the municipal documentation. Never accept their statements. Locate the actual documents. Therefore, I traveled to the municipal courthouse, that dusty underground level where all significant information gets concealed beneath generations of administrative neglect. The clerk, a pleasant woman named Betty who remembered Pop from his angling competition years, assisted me in retrieving the original land surveys. I'd acquired this technique from my labor union experience. Always verify the original documentation before some attorney attempts to deceive you with impressive letterhead. Why discovery infuriated me. My grandfather's parcel didn't merely extend to the shoreline. It incorporated 50 feet extending into the water. The official deed from 1963 was unmistakably clear. That dock wasn't encroaching on shared property. It was positioned directly within my portion of the lake. Here's the significant revelation. The HOA wasn't formed until 1998, 35 years following Pop's land acquisition, that I remembered my previous supervisor always mentioning that older properties frequently possess rights that newer developments cannot supersede. Something regarding grandfathered exemptions that override any community organization regulations. Equipped with duplicates of everything, I returned to my cabin feeling quite satisfied with myself. That contentment persisted precisely until I attempted departing for supplies and discovered Karen's Escalade positioned horizontally blocking my driveway. Not adjacent to it, not approaching it, directly obstructing it like she was performing some individual traffic enforcement. When I tapped on her window, she lowered it minimally to communicate through the opening. "Oh, Marcus, I'm simply examining the neighborhood parking codes. This could require considerable time." The mechanical sound of her operating engine combined with that sickeningly sweet air treatment created this bizarre atmosphere of passive-aggressive insanity. This was my situation. A mature individual who'd constructed half the region's electrical framework, being detained in my personal driveway by a suburban parent with a control obsession. Karen was merely beginning her campaign. Within a week, she'd established something titled the Lakeside Beautification Committee, which sounds pleasant until you comprehend it was essentially an attack squad targeting anyone failing to match her exclusive club vision. Abruptly, neighbors who'd acknowledged me for years were avoiding eye contact by crossing streets. Her social media posts were exceptional examples of passive-aggressive conflict. concerned regarding unsightly properties impacting all our residential values. Certain individuals simply don't value the neighborhood. The response section transformed into a hostile environment. Individuals I'd recognized for generations were suddenly property law authorities, repeating Karen's arguments as though she represented some property market profit point. Three of my neighbors actually offered private apologies. Tom and Susan Martinez approached me during my evening stroll and admitted that Karen had powerfully implied they complain about my property or confront their own citation bombardment. Apparently, she'd already targeted elderly Mr. Peterson for possessing non-compliant flower containers and threatened the young household with the infant regarding their offensive recreational equipment. She possesses information about everyone, Tom murmured, surveying the area as though Karen might be concealed in the vegetation with a camera. Her spouse works at the state governmental center. Connected, you understand, political matters. That struck me like an icy impact. This exceeded neighborhood conflict now. This individual had influence extending beyond our small lakeside neighborhood. That evening, I discovered orange spray paint covering my mailbox. Bright hostile strokes spelling comply or depart. My surveillance camera, solar-operated and concealed behind a pine, captured everything, including Karen's license identification as she departed at 2:30 a.m. When I contacted the sheriff's department the following morning, guess who appeared? Deputy Chad Cromwell, Karen's nephew. He examined the vandalism documentation once, shrugged, and stated, likely just youngsters. You understand their behavior. The coarse texture of that spray paint beneath my fingers as I attempted removing it felt like abrasive material against my spirit. Pop used to express, sometimes you require more powerful weapons for a more significant battle. Time to locate some more powerful weapons. Karen's subsequent action arrived disguised as civic responsibility, which somehow made it more maddening. She determined that direct confrontation wasn't succeeding, so she chose to weaponize the complete municipal administration against me. It commenced with a courteous knock from Building Inspector Dale Morrison, a person I'd actually collaborated with on multiple projects throughout the years. The uncomfortable expression on his face communicated everything I needed understanding before he spoke. Marcus, I'm truly apologetic regarding this, but I received a complaint about unpermitted constructions on your land. You know I must investigate these matters. 3 hours following, Dale had examined every portion of my cabin with his documentation and measurement equipment. His determination, everything not only satisfied regulations, but actually surpassed current safety requirements. Pop might have been traditional, but he'd constructed things permanently. Whoever submitted this complaint, Dale muttered as he gathered his equipment, either lacks knowledge or they're simply attempting to waste everyone's time. The subsequent day brought Environmental Officer Janet Bennett investigating allegations of my waste system contaminating the lake ecosystem. Again, operating perfectly, superior to most recent installations, she acknowledged. Then Fire Marshal Bob Rodriguez appeared to examine my solar equipment for dangerous electrical infractions. Clean approval there as well. Each inspection cost me a day of tranquility and a portion of my retirement sanity. More significantly, each false allegation was generating an official documentation trail that made me appear like some problematic property holder. I recalled something my labor union representative used to caution us about. Bureaucratic harassment represented a traditional tactic since it appeared legitimate on documentation, even when it was purely malicious persecution. While I was managing the inspection sequence, Karen was occupied playing her media strategy. She'd succeeded in getting herself featured by Channel 7's Community Spotlight program, presenting herself as this concerned citizen fighting to safeguard our family-oriented lake environment. The news segment was a masterpiece of selective modification. She displayed carefully positioned photographs that made my cabin appear like some backwoods structure, discussed hazardous situations endangering children's welfare, and portrayed herself as a courageous advocate confronting irresponsible property holders. What truly infuriated me was observing her standing on my dock, the one she alleged was unlawfully trespassing, while she performed her concerned citizen act for the cameras. The sharp sound of my phone vibrating with hostile messages from neighbors who'd viewed the segment felt like automatic weapon fire. Half the lakeside neighborhood now believed I represented some environmental threat. Here's where Karen committed her first genuine error. She became greedy. My former colleague Jake Martinez from the Electricians Union contacted me after viewing the news segment. Marcus, that woman's completely dishonest, and everyone recognizes it. You constructed half the sustainable energy framework in this region. Your solar configuration is the one I reference as an example when I'm instructing apprentices. Within 2 days, Jake had arranged a procession of my former colleagues to pass by and examine my property. Having 20 master electricians publicly confirm your work tends to eliminate the hazardous installation narrative quite rapidly. That's when circumstances started becoming interesting. My attorney friend Chuck Davis, we'd attended secondary school together, stopped by for a beverage and mentioned something that made me attentive. You know, Marcus, the Attorney General's department has been investigating HOA corruption situations across the state. Multiple neighborhoods reporting similar harassment sequences to what you're describing. What type of sequences? I inquired, though I was quite certain I already understood the response. Senior property holders getting struck with frivolous citations, property valuations artificially reduced, mysterious purchasers appearing with cash proposals. Sound familiar? It triggered every alarm I possessed. Chuck explained that these operations typically involved someone with political associations providing protection while the harassment operation drove out longtime residents. The properties would then get transferred to developers for substantial profits. The AG's department is seeking witnesses, Chuck continued. Individuals who've documented the harassment and can demonstrate the sequence. Someone like you might be precisely what they require. The mechanical sound of my refrigerator seemed unnaturally prominent as that information registered. Karen wasn't merely some power-obsessed neighbor. She was potentially part of something significantly larger and more systematic. That evening, I commenced a comprehensive record of every interaction, every citation, every inspection that had mysteriously appeared on my schedule. I also started researching Karen's background more thoroughly. Her husband, Robert Cromwell, wasn't merely some minor state employee. He was the Democratic Party treasurer, a position providing him access to development strategies, zoning modifications, and political advantages across multiple regions. The scent of fresh coffee mixing with morning lake atmosphere typically calmed me, but now it simply reminded me how much I had at risk. This wasn't about HOA charges anymore. This was about whether I'd become the next victim in someone else's profit operation. That Karen's subsequent phase made everything that preceded appear like a cordial disagreement. She'd apparently determined that bureaucratic harassment wasn't advancing sufficiently rapidly, so she switched to complete character destruction. It commenced with a social media post that made my stomach drop. Urgent safety concerns about aggressive conduct from lakefront resident. Please maintain your children away from the Eastern Shore section. Aggressive conduct? Me, the person who helped arrange the annual children's fishing competition for 15 years consecutively. Within hours, that post had been distributed 43 times. The response section transformed into a digital mob of individuals who'd never even encountered me, all persuaded I was some hazardous lunatic based on Karen's carefully constructed victim story. 2 days following, she submitted for a protective order. The petition, which became public documentation, depicted me as an unstable individual making verbal threats against neighborhood leaders. Complete invention. However, it was irrelevant. The submission alone became evidence that I was dangerous. Judge Patricia Hendricks, who actually knew my family from previous times, examined Karen's evidence once and rejected the request for absence of credible documentation. But the harm was completed. Now there existed an official court document with my name and the term threats on it. The emotional impact was beginning to affect me. I'd sit on Pop's veranda in the evenings, consuming a beverage and questioning whether this battle was worth destroying the peaceful retirement I'd labored 30 years to obtain. But just when I was beginning to consider surrendering, something wonderful occurred. The neighborhood started resisting. Judge Hendricks wasn't the only one who remembered my family. Retired Judge William Bill Carter, who used to fish with Pop back in the 70s, appeared at my entrance with a thermos of coffee and some unsolicited legal guidance. Marcus, that woman's playing a strategy your grandfather would have recognized immediately. She's relying on you feeling isolated and overwhelmed. Don't provide her that gratification. Bill explained that documented harassment operations like this typically indicated larger criminal activity. Individuals don't pursue this much difficulty over trivial neighborhood conflicts. There's money involved here. Substantial money. The local VFW Post, where I'd been a participant for 20 years, released a declaration calling Karen's accusations groundless attacks on a decorated neighborhood participant. The historical organization contributed, emphasizing my cabin's cultural importance as one of the final original constructions on the lake. Even the environmental organization that monitored lake water standards praised my sustainable lifestyle model. It felt like the complete, decent portion of our neighborhood was rallying around me. The bitter flavor of stress was finally transforming into something that felt like optimism. But Karen wasn't finished. Not remotely close. Her subsequent action was diabolical in its simplicity. She somehow persuaded the utility provider to investigate irregularities in my electrical provision. For 3 days, I had no electricity while they examined my solar system connection for safety infractions. Then arrived the false police allegations. Suspicious activity at my cabin during broad daylight. Loud disturbances suggesting potential domestic disruption when I was clearly alone. Possible drug activity based on the unusual quantity of visitors. Visitors who happened to be union colleagues stopping by to demonstrate support. Each call brought sheriff's deputies to my entrance. Each visit generated another incident documentation. Each documentation added to the expanding file that made me appear like a problematic resident. The most maddening aspect was that Deputy Chad Cromwell was typically the responding officer. He'd appear, ask a few perfunctory questions, and depart with this smirk that communicated he understood precisely what his aunt was doing. During one particularly surreal visit, he actually had the audacity to state, "You know, Mr. Henley, if you just apologized to my aunt and brought your property into adherence, all these difficulties would probably disappear." That's when I comprehended this wasn't just about me anymore. Karen was demonstrating other property holders what occurred when you didn't submit. The Hendersons, the senior couple who'd mysteriously chosen to sell, probably experienced this exact same catastrophe. The electronic notification of my phone became a source of anxiety instead of connection. Every alert could be another neighbor turning against me, another false allegation, another twist in Karen's psychological warfare operation. But it also brought messages of support from individuals I'd forgotten even knew me. The battle was distant from finished, but I was finally understanding the strategy's regulations. The breakthrough arrived when I was performing the most tedious thing imaginable, arranging paperwork for my appointment with the Attorney General's department. Chuck had arranged the complete situation, explaining that they required comprehensive documentation for their statewide HOA corruption investigation, that I was sitting at Pop's aged oak table, surrounded by stacks of citations, inspection documentations, and legal threats, when something captured my attention. One of Karen's infraction notices had this tiny footer I'd never paid attention to previously. Fines payable to Lakeside Estates Community Improvement Fund, account number 847291. Community Improvement Fund sounded authoritative enough, but something about it troubled me. Perhaps it was 30 years of reviewing electrical contracts and identifying the fine print that contractors use to deceive property holders. But I chose to investigate deeper. The county clerk's department had become my second residence by this point, so Betty knew precisely what I was seeking when I requested HOA financial documentation. She retrieved the public submissions and spread them across the counter like she was distributing cards. "Here's the situation, Marcus," she stated, adjusting her reading glasses. "Homeowner associations must submit annual documentations just like any other organization. Let me demonstrate what I discovered." The figures didn't calculate properly, not remotely close. Throughout the past 2 years, the HOA had gathered $280,000 in emergency evaluations for lake dock repairs that were never finished. Another $150,000 had supposedly been allocated to professional landscaping provisions provided by Cromwell Grounds and Maintenance, which according to state business documentation was possessed by Karen's brother-in-law. Here's the significant revelation. The landscaping company had been established precisely 3 weeks following Karen becoming HOA leader. I remembered Pop's guidance about following the financial trail. When someone establishes a business immediately after obtaining power, they're typically establishing it to redirect money to themselves. The insurance allegations were even more obvious. The HOA had submitted for storm damage compensation 3 times in the past 18 months. The difficulty was, I'd experienced every storm on this lake. and none of them had caused the type of damage that would warrant $95,000 in insurance settlements. Betty assisted me in cross-referencing the insurance allegations with actual weather documentation from the National Weather Service. The dates didn't correspond. The HOA was alleging storm damage on days when the weather had been perfectly clear. "Marcus," Betty whispered, even though we were alone in the documentation room, "this appears like fraud. Simple and straightforward fraud." My hands were actually trembling as I photocopied everything. The smooth sensation of those document pages felt like holding evidence that could transform everything. This wasn't merely harassment anymore. This was organized theft from the complete lakeside neighborhood. The property management charges were the final puzzle piece. The HOA was compensating $5,000 monthly to something titled Clearwater Property Solutions for administrative provisions. However, when I investigated the business registration, the listed location was a postal box in the same postal region where Karen resided. Everything connected perfectly like mechanisms in a lock. Karen's harassment operation wasn't just about power or personal malice. She was systematically reducing property valuations to facilitate a development operation while simultaneously embezzling from the neighborhood fund. The senior couples who'd transferred their cabins hadn't just been harassed into departing. They'd been compelled to sell at below-market prices because Karen's artificial property value concerns had frightened away legitimate purchasers. Those mysterious cash purchasers were probably associated with the same development organization that was benefiting from the embezzled funds that I contemplated the Hendersons, probably counting their limited finances in some cramped apartment, never understanding they'd been robbed twice. Once when they sold their dream residence for minimal value, and again through the charges they'd contributed into Karen's slush fund. The flavor of black coffee had never been so bitter. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore. Karen had been stealing from everyone, including the neighbors she persuaded to turn against me. Pop always expressed that when you discover corruption, it's typically larger than you anticipate. He was correct. Karen wasn't just operating an HOA. She was operating a criminal enterprise. And I was about to deliver the evidence to the one individual in the state who could terminate it permanently. That evening, I transformed Pop's back bedroom into something resembling a police investigation unit. Maps of the lake property spread across the walls, displaying original boundaries versus current HOA allegations. Timeline charts tracking Karen's harassment operation alongside suspicious financial transactions. Photographs, recordings, and documents organized by potential criminal charges that I felt like one of those television detectives. Except instead of pursuing serial criminals, I was pursuing suburban embezzlers. The Attorney General's department had assigned 2 prosecutors to my situation, Sarah Mitchell and David Bennett, who arrived the following morning appearing like they meant business. Sarah was this sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who reminded me of the safety inspectors who used to maintain us honest on job locations. David was younger, perhaps early 30s, but he possessed this quiet intensity that suggested he'd already sent plenty of financial criminals to prison. "Mr. Henley," Sarah stated, spreading the financial documents across Pop's dining table, "what you've uncovered here exceeds simple HOA harassment. This is systematic fraud that could impact dozens of families." David retrieved a tablet and started connecting patterns I hadn't even observed. "We've been investigating similar operations in 4 other regions. The sequence is always identical. Politically connected individuals use HOA positions to manipulate property valuations while embezzling neighborhood funds." That's when they informed me about the FBI involvement. Agent Rebecca Torres from the Financial Crime Unit had been tracking development fraud across the area. Apparently, my documentation was the missing component that could connect together multiple ongoing investigations. "The advantage of financial crimes," Agent Torres explained during our video call, "is that everything leaves a documentation trail. Your HOA documentation shows classic money laundering, fake invoices, shell companies, insurance fraud. But we require more than just documents. We require witnesses and recorded evidence of ongoing criminal activity." Chuck, my attorney friend, had been working behind the scenes as well. He'd connected with 17 other lakefront families who'd experienced similar harassment. When we assembled them at the VFW hall, their accounts painted a picture that made my blood boil. The Thompsons had compensated $8,000 in fraudulent infraction charges before transferring their cabin for 30% below market valuation. The Garcias had been struck with emergency evaluations totaling $12,000 for lake improvements that never materialized. Elderly Mrs. Patterson had been so intimidated by Karen's legal threats that she'd relocated with her daughter in Florida, abandoning the residence where she'd lived for 43 years. Every account followed the same playbook: escalating harassment, manufactured infractions, pressure to sell, and every family had contributed to that community improvement fund that was really just Karen's personal treasury. Here's what most individuals don't understand about HOA fraud, explained retired accountant Frank Weber, who'd volunteered to help analyze the financial documentation. Homeowner associations are required to submit tax returns annually if they meet certain income thresholds. Legitimate organizations submit religiously. Corrupt ones typically don't because honest accounting would expose their theft. Frank had discovered that our HOA hadn't submitted proper tax returns in over 2 years despite gathering hundreds of thousands in charges and evaluations. That single fact could trigger federal tax evasion charges on top of everything else. The technical strategy session felt like planning a military operation. We possessed financial evidence, witness testimony, recorded harassment, and documented fraud. But Agent Torres desired something larger. She desired to catch Karen in the act of actively committing crimes. The most effective way to build an airtight situation, she explained, is to create circumstances where the suspect's criminal conduct is captured by law enforcement in real time. We require her to incriminate herself on camera. That's when Chuck suggested the perfect arrangement. The Attorney General has been seeking an opportunity to announce new HOA reform legislation. What if she held that announcement at Marcus's cabin? It's symbolically perfect, protecting property holder rights in the precise location where those rights were violated. Sarah's eyes illuminated. And if Karen's sequence holds, she'll absolutely attempt to disrupt any suspicious activity at Marcus's property. Her need to control the situation will override her common sense. We spent the subsequent week preparing for what Agent Torres called a controlled confrontation scenario. Professional recording equipment concealed throughout my cabin, undercover officers positioned around the lake, multiple law enforcement agencies coordinated for rapid response. The neighborhood coalition had grown as well. Local media was alerted to potential breaking news. Social media operations were ready to counter any false narratives Karen might attempt to spin. Support networks were activated for the post-confrontation period. Why Old Union training activated. When you're planning a complex job, you prepare for every possible scenario and always have backup systems. We had backup strategies for the backup strategies. The trap was arranged. Karen's sequence of conduct was so predictable that we could practically script her subsequent action. All we had to do was wait for her to break down the entrance. Literally, Karen must have sensed the walls closing in because her conduct went from calculated harassment to complete sabotage. It was like observing a cornered animal lash out in every direction, getting more hazardous as her options disappeared. The first indication was my solar equipment mysteriously malfunctioning on a Tuesday morning. I'd wake up to dead batteries and error codes flashing on the inverter display. When my electrician friend Jake came out to investigate, he found clear evidence of tampering. Wire connections loosened just enough to disrupt the system without causing obvious damage. "Marcus, this is professional-level sabotage," Jake stated, photographing the evidence with his phone. "Whoever did this knows electrical systems. They wanted to cause problems without leaving obvious fingerprints." But Jake was smarter than Karen gave him credit for. He'd installed a hidden surveillance camera near the electrical panel after the first incident. 2 nights following, we captured her red-handed, creeping around my property at 3 in the morning with a screwdriver and wire cutters. The footage was crystal clear. Karen Cromwell, HOA leader and upstanding neighborhood participant, vandalizing private property under cover of darkness. The acrid scent of her cigarette smoke lingered in the morning atmosphere, mixing with the pine scent that usually made me feel peaceful. Next arrived my boat dock. I'd gone into town for supplies and returned to find my boat drifting halfway across the lake. The heavy-duty chains I'd used to secure it had been cut with bolt cutters, clean, deliberate cuts that left metal fragments scattered across the dock planks. That boat had been Pop's pride and joy, a 1978 base boat that still operated like a dream. Finding it bumping against the opposite shore, its hull scratched from the rocks, felt like someone had desecrated his grave. But Karen's biggest error was targeting my waste system. I just passed a regional inspection with flying colors, but suddenly my perfectly functioning system started backing up. The smell was horrific. That combination of sewage and chemical additives that made your eyes water from 50 feet away. When the emergency septic service arrived, they found industrial-grade drain cleaner had been poured down my system, killing all the beneficial bacteria and creating a toxic mess. This is deliberate sabotage, the technician explained, holding up soil samples that showed chemical contamination. Someone pumped commercial-grade acids into your system. This material costs serious money and requires specialized knowledge to use. The repair bill was $3,200. But more importantly, the chemical analysis provided forensic evidence that this wasn't random vandalism. It was calculated destruction requiring insider knowledge of waste systems. While I was managing sewage backup, Karen was orchestrating her media blitz. Anonymous accounts flooded social media with posts about my ongoing property infractions and deteriorating conditions threatening neighborhood safety. The automated accounts were so obvious, it was almost comical. Dozens of profiles with generic names posting identical complaints within minutes of each other. She'd also increased the intimidation network. Deputy Chad Cromwell's patrol presence increased dramatically. He'd cruise by my cabin 4 or 5 times per day, always slowing down just enough to make his surveillance obvious. Sometimes he'd sit in my driveway for 20 minutes, running license plates of anyone who visited. The building inspector suddenly found code infractions in work that had passed inspection just weeks before. The fire marshal received anonymous tips about fire hazards that didn't exist. Environmental services got allegations about illegal dumping in areas of my property they'd already cleared. IT was death by 1,000 cuts designed to exhaust my resources and break my spirit through bureaucratic warfare. But I wasn't the only target anymore. Karen had started targeting my supporters as well. Jake's electrical contracting license was suddenly under review for safety infractions. Bill Carter, the retired judge who'd been advising me, received a formal complaint with the State Bar Association about improper legal counsel to non-clients. The VFW Post found themselves facing a surprise fire safety inspection that threatened to shut down their weekly bingo nights. The Historical Society was struck with zoning complaints about their downtown office space. Karen was systematically attacking anyone who'd shown me support, sending a clear message: help Marcus Henley and you'll become our next target. The psychological pressure was intense. Every morning brought new crises, new emergencies, new bureaucratic nightmares to navigate. The metallic flavor of constant stress became as familiar as my morning coffee. But Karen's desperation was also creating opportunities. Each escalation was being documented by law enforcement. Every act of sabotage provided additional criminal evidence. Her network of supporters was starting to distance themselves as her conduct became increasingly unhinged. The Attorney General's department was observing everything, building an airtight situation while Karen dug her hole deeper with every vengeful act. Agent Torres called it textbook criminal escalation. When perpetrators feel cornered, they often make increasingly reckless decisions that provide prosecutors with the evidence they need for conviction. Karen was walking straight into our trap, one sabotage solar panel at a time. Karen's final play was so audacious, it almost succeeded. She'd figured out through her husband's political associations that I wasn't just meeting with some random state official. I was meeting with Attorney General Patricia Williamson herself. And instead of backing down, Karen chose to go nuclear. Her strategy was brilliant in its twisted logic. She would position herself as the victim of a political conspiracy, claiming that the state's top prosecutor was targeting her family for partisan reasons. If she could record herself confronting government corruption at my cabin, she could flip the entire narrative and paint herself as a courageous whistleblower standing up to abuse of power. The first indication of her new strategy came through social media. She'd reached out to Government Accountability Watch, one of those blogger networks that amplifies accounts about bureaucratic overreach. Her pitch was perfect: small-town HOA leader being persecuted by big government because her husband worked for the opposing political party. Local family under attack. State officials use harassment investigation to silence political opposition was the headline that started circulating 3 days before my scheduled appointment. The account painted me as some kind of deep state operative working with corrupt prosecutors to destroy an innocent family. The response section was flooded with outrage from individuals who'd never heard of our lakeside neighborhood, but were absolutely persuaded that Karen was being railroaded by partisan prosecutors. She'd tapped into that vein of anti-government sentiment that runs through rural neighborhoods, turning herself into a martyr for political persecution. But Karen's masterstroke was the live broadcast arrangement. She'd organized to broadcast her confrontation with the Attorney General live on social media, framing it as citizen journalism exposing government corruption in real time. Her strategy was to burst into my cabin during the appointment, record everything, and let her followers spread the footage as evidence of official misconduct. What she didn't know was that we were monitoring her communications. Agent Torres had obtained warrants for Karen's phone and social media accounts weeks earlier. We knew about the blogger outreach, the live broadcast strategy, even the talking points she'd prepared for her spontaneous confrontation. "It's actually perfect," Agent Torres explained during our final coordination appointment. "She's going to commit multiple felonies on live video while providing us with a real-time confession of her motives. We couldn't have scripted it better." The irony was delicious. Karen thought she was setting a trap for us, but she was actually walking into the most thoroughly documented arrest in HOA history. Her support network was crumbling as well, but she was too obsessed to notice. The other HOA board participants had quietly distanced themselves once the financial irregularities became obvious. Her husband was facing his own ethics investigation and couldn't provide political protection anymore.